Dear learners, I am Christina Georgy, your academic counselor. In this video, we are moving on to Unit 5 titled Coping with Stress. We have already discussed the first block and its very many units in our previous sessions. In this particular session, we will be discussing block 2 of BPCS-186, and this particular block consists of many units, and today's focus will be Unit 5 titled Coping with Stress. In this particular session, we will study the definition and nature of coping. We look at the very many goals of coping. There are some coping styles such as proactive coping, avoidant coping, emotion focused coping, problem focused coping, and many more. So we will have a detailed understanding of all these aspects in this particular session. First and foremost, let's have an idea regarding the definition of coping. In simple terms, coping can be described as the ways in which a person tries to deal with stress experienced by him or her. So, when an individual tries on his own to deal with a stressful situation, a stressor that he experiences, it can be considered as coping. So this person may be able to deal effectively with stress if this person adopts effective coping skills. So what happens if his coping skills are not effective? Obviously he won't be able to deal effectively with stress. So it is of great importance to have effective coping strategies. So if you look at your textbook, you can see various definitions of coping. One famous definition is that coping refers to the individual's response to a psychological stressor which is often related to a negative event. So coping can be described as the deliberate efforts that are directed towards decreasing the negative effects that could be psychological, physical, or even social of the stressful situation. That is, by coping, a person is trying to get over the stressful situation, or rather trying to reduce the ill effects of this particular stressor. So remember, Lazarus and Folkman, we studied their definition of stress. Like the way they have defined stress, they have also defined coping in the year 1980 itself. So coping has been defined by Lazarus and Folkman in 1980 as efforts, both cognitive and behavioral, that are directed towards overcoming, decreasing, or enduring the internal and external demands. So these are cognitive and behavioral efforts which are made in order to overcome, decrease, or endure the internal and external demands made by the stressor. So there is an effort to deal with the demands that are created on the resources of an individual as a result of stress. Coping in this context could either be instrumental or be palliative in nature. What do you mean by instrumental coping? It refers to, or it is denoted by, results of cognitive appraisal or conflicts related to emotions. Appraisal refers to assessment. Alright. So it is denoted by results of cognitive appraisal or conflicts related to emotion, whereas palliative coping is denoted by regulation of emotions as a result of cognitive appraisal of the stressful event or situation. So if you look into the textbook, there are some 8 to 10 definitions perhaps. So there are very many definitions. Just make sure that you read and understand all these definitions. You can study a few which you find easier for you to prepare effectively for your TEE. Anyway, be aware of the definition, or rather the concept put forth by Lazarus and Folkman. Then another easy definition is by Han. Han explained coping as an effort directed towards using the resources to overcome the difficulties as the obstacles are encountered. There is Gardner's definition of coping as well. That is, they define coping as, I quote, the process of thoughts and behaviors that people use to manage the internal and external demands of situations they appraise as being stressful or exceeding their own resources. Coping efforts seek to manage, master, tolerate, reduce or minimize the demands of a stressful situation. I unquote. The coping may aim at dealing with the problem that is the cause of any distress. So coping could be adaptive or maladaptive in nature. So what do you mean by an adaptive coping? An adaptive coping reduces stress, but it may have long-term positive effects as well. It reduces stress and it has long-term positive effects. But maladaptive coping can be viewed in a negative light because it can give you relaxation only for a short period of time. Moreover, it has negative impact on physical and psychological health of the individual. For example, maladaptive coping strategies would include the consumption of alcohols or drugs or smoking or being overcritical to oneself and so on. Whereas adaptive coping strategies would include measures such as practicing meditation or doing yoga, etc. Personality also determines how stress is perceived by an individual. It also determines how a person reacts and copes with stress also. Yesterday we studied that people with type A personality will be prone to stress to a greater extent. I hope you remember. So individuals having varied personalities will display different coping styles and strategies. In our last class, we studied hardness also as a factor, right? So psychological hardness can be described as an individual's ability to deal with stressful situations with resilience. Hardness can be related with three main aspects, which are the commitment, control and challenge. These can determine the response to stress or coping strategy employed by the individual as well. Do you remember the term learned helplessness that we discussed in our previous session? It is a concept introduced by Seligman. Yes, this term is used to describe the interference with adaptive responding produced by inescapable shock and also as a shorthand to describe the process which we believe underlies the behavior. The coping process that an individual goes through may differ based on this concept of learned helplessness. So Antonovsky described sense of coherence as enduring through dynamic feelings of confidence, and he has made use of three major points to explain that. First one, the stimuli deriving from one's internal and external environments in the course of living are structured, predictable and explicable. The second point, the resources are available to one to meet the demands posed by these stimuli. And the third one, the demands are challenges worthy of investment and engagement. Have you noticed that men and women also differ in the way they cope with stress? Women are more likely to employ coping strategies that are more positive in nature. More adaptive strategies of coping are being practiced by women. That is what studies prove. They indulge in self-talk or seeking support from others, or they do continuously worry about the stressful event and so on. So they are the ones, the women are the ones who are prone to develop learned helplessness. Women are more likely to employ coping strategies like positive self-talk, seeking support from others, etc. Though they are also more prone to develop learned helplessness. Men, on the other hand, would engage in maladaptive coping strategies. Yes, that is what I said. Women would be more into adaptive coping strategies, whereas man would be into the consumption of drugs or alcohol. It is not a universalized, generalized idea. It is what studies prove. Alright. Further, women are more prone to using the coping strategies that target at bringing about the change in their emotional reactions to a situation that is stressful, whereas men are more likely to focus on the problem. The root cause is what the men focus on. Women also experience more psychological distress as well as they display symptoms of depression and anxiety to a higher extent when compared with men. So all these are examples of how gender difference and coping can be analyzed. Men and women differ in the way they cope with stress. Now moving on to the goals of coping. This is also important. They may ask you the goals of coping. Yes, let's straightly discuss the 4 main goals of coping. Firstly, to enhance the possibility of recovery by decreasing the negative environmental conditions. 2, to be able to adjust to the negative situation. 3, to maintain a self-image that is positive and maintain emotional balance. 4, ensure positive interpersonal relationship. Coping is termed as effective when it leads to recovery and when the individual is able to adapt to the stressful situation by means of maintaining a positive image about oneself, emotional balance, and has effective interpersonal relationships. So as the nature of coping is now clear, let's focus our attention towards the coping styles and strategies. Coping styles can be categorized as proactive coping, avoidant coping, emotion-focused coping, and problem-focused coping. This is important. Please make sure that you read and understand this area. Let's firstly consider proactive coping. So in proactive coping, the individual will directly confront the stressful situation or event. It is the fight response that is happening here. This person will directly, boldly face the stress. Alright. An individual adopting this type of coping will take direct action by developing a better idea about the stress creating situation. So there are various stages of proactive coping, namely 5 stages are there. You need to study the names of these 5 stages also. That is stage 1, accumulation of resources. Stage 2, identifying or anticipating the potential stressor. Stage 3, initial appraisal. Stage 4, preliminary efforts to cope with the stressful situation. Stage 5, seeking feedback and using the same. Okay, let's focus our attention towards the first stage, accumulation of resources. In order to be able to deal with the stressful situation, the individual will make attempts to accumulate resources. What kind of resources? This could be in terms of gathering information so as to understand the stressful situation in a better way. So in order to face the stress as such, this person will collect information related to this situation. Now comes stage 2, identifying or anticipating the potential stressor. For instance, if it is expected that supervisor may ask for a certain report, the employee will anticipate the stressor and start working on the report beforehand. During such a situation, if you are aware of the fact that there is a probability of your boss asking for a particular file, you can anticipate this potential stressor and you can start working on this report or say file in advance. So that would be stage 2. What about stage 3? It is the initial appraisal, the first assessment. Initial appraisal of the stress creating situation is carried out during this time. Now comes stage 4, preliminary efforts to cope with the stressful situation. Based on this initial assessment, preliminary efforts, that is the first primary efforts to cope with the stressful situation, is carried out. In case these efforts do not show any positive results, then some other action is taken in order to deal with the situation. There will always be a backup plan as well. Now it is important to seek feedback. That is part of stage 5. Based on the previous stages, that is based on stages 3 and 4, a feedback is sought and is used so that modifications and changes can be carried out in this plan. So that was the fight response, proactive coping. The opposite here is avoidant coping, more like the flight response. Have a look at this avoidant coping. So as the very name suggests, the individual here will try to avoid the stress creating situation or may give less importance to the stressful event. So what happens? The behavior that is displayed by the individual is directed towards avoiding certain thoughts or avoiding certain feelings that could rise due to the stressful situation. Avoidance coping can result in individuals experiencing not just stress and anxiety, it can also have an impact on self-confidence of the individual. They have also defined this avoidance coping. If you get time, please do read on that as well. So now comes emotion-focused coping and problem-focused coping. As the very title or the name suggests, the first one is focused on emotion while the second one focuses on the problem as such. So emotion focused coping can be differentiated from problem focused coping as its purpose is to manage emotions that are related with the stressful situation rather than modifying the situation. Emotion focused coping involves management of the emotional reactions towards the events that cause stress. So some of the drawbacks of this coping are that it may not be as effective as the source of the stress is not dealt with, and as such no long-term solution is sought. So here the focus is on the emotion, right? So as a consequence, what happens is that the root source of the stress is not dealt with and it might not result for a long period of time either. Using emotion focused coping can help in decreasing the negative effects of the stress on the individual, and it will help the individual accept the situation and will thus lead to decrease in the experience of chronic stress. It will certainly decrease chronic stress and it will lead to contentment in life and bring about positivity. Remember, there are both negative and positive effects to this particular strategy. If we move on to problem focused coping, it involves identifying the source of the problem so as to either deal with it or modify it. The proactive coping that we discussed earlier is more or less closely related to this type of coping. Problem-focused coping also involves taking control of the situation, the stressful situation, seeking information about it, and evaluation of positive and negative aspects in this situation. So which are the various stages involved in problem-solving coping? It includes management of time, seeking support, seeking help from others, planning, and so on. Have you heard of this appraisal-focused coping? You might not have heard. This is yet another coping style proposed by Carver and Connor in the year 2010. So in this appraisal focused coping style, The assumptions of an individual with regard to his or her perception of the stressor are challenged by means of a cognitive reprisal. So that is something that you need to have an idea on. Coping can also be categorized as combative coping and preventive coping, and this is stated by Folkman. In combative coping, in order to deal with the stressor, the individual makes an attempt to remove the stressor by overcoming it. Yes, it is removed by overcoming it. So it involves monitoring of stress, resource accumulation, dealing with the stressor by attacking it directly, tolerance of stress, and also decreasing arousal. So in preventive coping, what happens is that cognitive restructuring takes place so that the stressor is not threatening anymore. One's own potential for resistance is also strengthened here so that the stressor can be prevented from occurring. So preventive coping includes adjustment so that the stressors can be avoided. So that was preventive coping. So with that, we come to the end of this unit where we discuss the definition and nature of coping along with the various coping styles and strategies. So in the next unit, we will deal with stress management technique, and we will discuss that in the next session.